Steve Bierman, and welcome to Signs of the Upwising. The Great Upwising is a playful yet pertinent term I use to describe a rapidly maturing body politic awakening beyond woke and anti-woke, seeing that we're all on the same side and that we can turn our mutually destructive political tug of war into a mutually beneficial tug of peace where we all pull together in the same direction. The Signs of the Uprising podcast is designed to point out the islands of awakened sanity and to help this movement without a name gain traction and momentum. Well, our guest today, Christopher Life, has a workable strategy to bring left and right front and center to face the music and dance together by creating a viable, effective independence movement where finally the body politic can declare independence from the two-party system responsible for our current new word situation. Christopher is a civic activist. He's an organizer, movement builder, and he's focused on creating a unified independent movement outside the traditional Republican and Democratic framework. He's founder and CEO of United Independence, which is a coalition that seeks to connect independent voters, reform organizations, candidates, and civic leaders into what they call a united independent movement. So welcome, Christopher.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm happy you're here. I first met Christopher, I believe, when I attended a United Independence conference convention in Austin 3 years ago. And what really impressed me about that event was that there were so many diverse points of view represented, all interacting kindly and respectfully, and looking to counteract the divide and conquer racket with a unite and prevail movement. Now, what seems to be locked in a uniparty with two different faces, two different brands, Democrat or Republican, independent political movements seem to have been thwarted at every turn. But I'm really excited about this. The work that Christopher and his team have been doing for years now, I think is finally ready to bear fruit. And my sense is that they've developed a workable strategy focused on gathering people together to end corruption and then proving the viability of this movement. So before we get into the strategy and the plan, Christopher, some background. How did you come to this work and find your calling here?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for having me on your show today. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, I mean, when I was a younger guy, I kind of had this naive perspective on wanting to make the best world possible and didn't really know how to go about doing that. That led me on a journey to study international security and conflict resolution and go to Africa and work in poverty alleviation work for years. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion that what was happening in America was having a greater effect on the quality of life of not only Americans, but people around the world through our geopolitical activities and our Western finance sector, putting countries around the world into parasitic loans and undermining quality of life of people. Once I really kind of realized the impact America was having around the world, I realized there was nothing I could do with my life more impactful than striving to design a process by which we address, arrest, and transform the dynamics in America that basically we could refer to as commonplace corruption and dysfunction in our public institutions. That was like 15 years ago. And that spark was the start of the journey. And then what could I, as one person, do about that became the next question you have to ask and answer. And I started early on looking at different historical revolutions from across the world in the last couple of centuries that had been successful in order to build my confidence that national revolutions are actually viable. Like you can fundamentally transform a regime that's controlled a nation that up until the point that that regime changes seems to be impervious to change. And this happens over and over and over again. And so that kind of helped me feel confident that it was possible that despite how entrenched the incumbent systems are, that creating a positive, transformative process for our country was possible and actually things change. That's the reality. Things not changing isn't a reality. And so I knew that things would change because everything always changes. So then, how is it going to change? And how can I and how can we as American citizens participate in directing our country so that as it changes for the better and not for the worse, because we know that change is inevitable. And so that's kind of what started me on my journey. And then, from that point on, you had to ask the questions of, okay, what are the core problems? What are possible solutions? How do we build a populist movement to help people to drive the possible solutions in order to solve the core problems? And that got me on my journey of identifying that American independents that have declared independence, both psychologically and from an affiliation standpoint, from the two major parties. And there's like 100 million Americans that fit in that category. Like I didn't have to look any further for where the populist movement was. That is the populist movement that we can build. But it was nascent. It was potential. It was latent. It was maybe soil that had been tilled but not planted yet. So then, how we convert the sentiment of individuals who have relinquished their loyalty to one of the major party narratives and party affiliations, and how you can turn that into 1 million people, 10 million people, 50 million people coherently polling in the same direction and in a direction that's strategically relevant. That becomes the next question. And so, I see myself as a movement developer and a movement leader of the independent space. I'm not the only one, but I think I am one of the only ones that really has a coherent narrative of a united independent movement and a coherent theory of change of how an independent movement can tip a set of dominoes that doesn't just make sure that independents have a voice in politics, but actually a set of dominoes that results in a metamorphosis process for our nation so we can move systematically over maybe 10, 20, 30 years from commonplace corruption to real representation, right? From civic degradation to civic integrity, from a country that is Swiss cheese by way of being able to have all kinds of access points for the capturability of our public institutions to one that's sealed off, where corporations and wealthy individuals have a role in our society, but not in one that dominates the public institutions that are supposed to be able to regulate them. Like we need to restructure the kind of social contract between what the public institution is as the regulator of industry and what the industry is as the creator of value for society. And right now we've got industries that are basically the regulators of government to make sure that government dysregulates industry so that it can do whatever it wants to maximize profits regardless of the cost. And those are the problems that we as American citizens, what I refer to as American patriots, need to be able to solve, which isn't a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It's an American issue. So we have to first recognize that we are independent American citizens, look upon our republic in the state of the affairs, recognize the ideals the founders stated for us 250 years ago, assess the degree to which we are aligned with those ideals or not, and what we must do to course correct back towards governance of, by, and for the people in service to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all.
I mean, that really harkens back to the founding of the country, goes right back to that. And somehow we've, and the warnings against factions and political parties and so on. And what we have right now is we've got dueling narratives that have gotten more extreme and more toxic, that have polarized people more than ever before, perhaps. And so we have this, I forget the statistics, I'm sure you can fill me in on that, of what percentage of people would actually prefer working together than devolving into these, when election time comes, the lesser of two evils, or however you want to put it, that keeps the system in place. Divide and conquer. So your movement is about unite and prevail. So before we actually talk about what's going on right now, I want a little bit more about, I'm always impressed when people are able to build movements. To be able to go from I'm an individual with a dream to finding the compatriots, collaborators, teammates, close teammates, coalition mates, and and putting that together. So I want to get some of that from you. You're in that 15-year period, probably more later than sooner. How did you, what was your strategy for actually building this movement and cohering, herding these cats, so to speak, everybody with their own agenda, uh, all of these organizations trying to stay afloat, um, maybe in some ways competing at the trough for some of the same financial resources that have become more scarce for projects like these. What was your strategy, first of all, for bringing together that event that I went to 3 years ago that I thought was a brilliant, brilliant first step?
Yeah, I think the answer and organizing the event is the answer to your question around our first stage of movement building. So we founded the Independent National Convention. Didn't exist before. And our first one was in Cheyenne, Wyoming in 2020. Our second one was slated for 2022, but we postponed it, so it ended up early 2023. And our third was in 2024. So it's a biennial event. And before the Independent National Convention, there wasn't a national event to bring independents together, to bring leaders from independent parties or third parties together. Um, and so that was step one, is actually create, bring people together. And so at INC 2020, we had 13 different political parties represented under one roof, sharing a stage and discussing and maybe meeting each other for the first time in person or whatnot, humanizing the different actors and characters in the movement. Our flagship panel for INC 23, which you may have been in the audience for, was independent parties working together. I don't think that had ever been a conversation before. And we had representatives from No Labels and Forward Party and Libertarian Party and some other groups. I moderated that panel, and I said, okay, great, let's start this conversation, and not like let's start it for the next 45 minutes, but let's start it for the next several years for our country. Let's start the conversation of how independent parties work together and how we can recognize what our common ground is, and that the path of independent political actors working in silos, fragmented, and factionalized amongst themselves is inherently, totally, and inarguably futile. So let's recognize the futility first and foremost of that type of siloed element, and recognize that if we were to coordinate our resources and our financial donor bases and our organizer capabilities, then we've got something to work with, And then RFK came around in 2024. And that he wasn't part of a necessarily independent party, but certainly was the flagship of what was happening in the independent movement in the 24 election cycle. So we have these kind of different independent parties. We have the different characters, the individuals, going back to Ross Perot and so many others over the years, that are just kind of stoking the fire of the independent spirit. But there hasn't been a container that has been able to hold that spirit in aggregate in a unified fashion. And that's what we showed up to the scene to be able to offer. And so our organization is called United Independence. And we started creating the conventions, and we brought together hundreds of different organizations in the course of those three events. So we've built relationships. I've built relationships with those folks. Started to have influence, right? So if I had a vision for something and gave a keynote address on that topic in front of several hundred kind of delegates of the independent space, and something of that resonated, well, now we're starting to pass along ideas and pass along a way of having a shared narrative and a shared vision. And at the end of 2024, at the INC in 2024, I kind of took a pretty bold step, and I said, look, the goal of the independent movement next needs to be electing a block of independents to Congress. Here's why. It will legitimize the movement. It will be this definitive kind of sandbox of an operation that can drive a greater level of coordination amongst different independent actors to help to achieve this specific outcome. A block of independents could act as a governance fulcrum, making final decisions between the left and the right, because if you have 5 or 6 independents, you could prevent either party from having a majority. So now this like common sense, populist driven block in the center now becomes the final decision maker, which then can start to negotiate what is included in that policy and call out pork barrel stuff and call out corruption stuff along the way to be able to get the vote. So I kind of said, look, let's try and do this. And I was really happy to see that in the months to come, several different organizations, including Forward Party, including the Independent Center, including other groups, started to also champion, hey, let's start to focus on getting a block of independents elected to Congress. Great. So the events create a context to create a narrative, to discuss, to dialogue. We had a panel conversation at the INC about this topic as well. And these are the types of things that kind of go from nothing to something, right? And if you use like a crane, like the bird, like an origami crane as a metaphor, if I started with a blank piece of paper and the United Independent Movement is like the crane, I don't want to pretend like the crane's here, but I've made 7 or 8 really good folds in that origami project
Yeah.
in that direction. So there's more community, there's larger events, there's greater influence, there's greater shared narrative, there's greater interoperability between the independent sector. But there's still a very big journey to come. And you'll see that every single thing that our organization does is in service to helping that independent space coalesce into a united independent movement. So we started with the convention. That's a big step in the right direction. We're going to have a whole merchandise line for independent movement, united independent movement, because we need to see people across the country wearing independent gear and swag for sure. We have the independent certification program, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. That's all tied into all of this. We're presenting a slate of independents in the midterms to be able to foreground the independent candidates that we see are most likely for a win and most aligned with the core ethos of integrity of the independent movement. So we're moving from a field of just every independent candidate's on its own to no, we're platforming these 7, and that's going to come out in July, and we'll kind of run a summer and fall campaign to champion a slate of independent candidates rather than just an individual, which helps to move the conversation into a collective rather than just all this kind of fragmented activity. And then we can invite concentrated support from donors and volunteers from across the country, not just to their local independent candidate, because that can be diluting and diffusing important energy that will go nowhere, but say, look, we need to concentrate our support behind these specific 6 or 7 candidates. So these are all the different things that we've done to be able to start to, I wouldn't say build a movement, I would say to increase the degree of coherence and coalescence and alignment and coordination of an independent sector in order to take steps in the direction of building a united independent movement. And I'll be championing this for the rest of my life. So if it coalesces this year, great. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever it takes, we're just going to keep building the building blocks until one day you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 million Americans who say, I'm an American citizen, I'm an independent citizen, I'm a part of the United Independent Movement, and here's the role I'm playing in this overarching theory of change to get these people elected, to institute these civic innovations, to move these policies forward, to drive these anti-corruption programs in our country, to be able to reclaim our country from captured corporate interests. And that'll be a really proud moment. And we're still gearing up for that.
Well, you said a key word, and that key word is coherence. That, again, there's that famous saying by Breitbart that politics is downstream of culture. And so essentially what I saw at that conference that I went to is the beginning of creating a culture where people are able to put aside their siloed interests, not give them up, but put them aside in order to create this bigger movement that actually will move all positive, lift all positive boats. Everything that's designed to bring more life and love to a community can be uplifted by this, I call it my jokey way, putting all good intentions under one big intent. And so you have this big intent of a united independent movement to be able to stand up to corruption. And we'll talk more about how we prove that, but I noticed in looking at your slate of 7 or independent candidates Some are designated themselves as independents, some are Democrats, some are Republicans. And so the idea is that even inside the system, where people are already representing the people and voting and running for office, um, there's a sense of and you'll talk more about this anti-corruption pledge aspect of it, but that's a way to actually cohere people around this idea. And I think that this is an awakening awareness. Everybody I talk to, whether they identify as Democrat, Republican, Independent, they all say the system is not working for me. The system is not helping my life. And frankly, not only don't the Democrats or Republicans represent me, that's one level of understanding it, but the entire system is is an adverse system to my well-being. That the entire system, this interlocking duopoly, if you will, and all of the media and all of the power of money, etc., and power of tribalism that keeps this system in place. Finally, what you said, through this coherence, finally there's an understanding. Hey, wait a minute. There's way more of us. What would happen if the 90% of us who are not sociopaths, what if we actually centered around the virtues and values that we share in common? And then we recognize, wait a minute, we can actually create a united stand against corruption and actually shift things that way through a coherent, independent movement. So, um, first of all, tell me more about the strategy. So, let's say, what would happen if one or more of these candidates got elected? Wouldn't it encourage other people to go, yeah, it can be done?
Yeah, Roger Bannister, broke the 4 minute mile before doctors believed that it was anatomically impossible for a human to run a 4 minute mile. And Roger didn't seem to care about that. And he broke that. And within months to follow, runners around the world also did the same thing because a psychological barrier collapsed and they were able to put a certain type of energy into the effort to get a particular result. So so Americans right now have a collective limiting belief like that. We can't run a 4 minute mile, that independents can't win. Independents don't win federal office. So when we prove that outcome, and it's a little bit different with Bernie Sanders and Angus King because they've kind of been associated with the existing establishment. And so that hasn't really produced that same kind of breakthrough belief for a lot of other Americans. But when people come right through the center outside of any particular establishment affiliation and start winning as independent American citizens, then you're going to collapse that psychological belief and you're going to have more good talent enter the space. You're going to have more incumbents consider that running for reelection as independent. You're going to have more political donors write checks to independents because they actually believe that there's a chance. And most importantly, you're going to have more independents vote for independence when November comes around. Because right now we have independents who identify as independent, but if they still don't believe that independent can win, they're not going to vote for something they believe is, or many of them are not going to vote for something they believe is inherently futile. So those initial wins are kind of designed to kind of crank that engine of that Model T Ford, to use that metaphor, to kind of build a positive feedback loop to get everything revved up. So I do think that that's what we could potentially see in 2026 with Dan Osborne. I think is probably the number one highest chance of an independent, purely independent, running and winning for Senate in Nebraska. And that will have huge.
Didn't the Democrat bow out of the election and that the Democrat just quit in order to give Dan Osborne a chance to run against this Republican? I
So the
thought that
de-
was rather extraordinary.
so the Democrat wouldn't be the spoiler.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a good sign.
Yeah, and I think we're going to start to see more of that. And
Yeah.
the trends are inarguable, right? So you can look at the graph for the last 30 years to see how independence has been increasing proportionally in America. And right now they're hitting 46, 49, 51% based on different polls. So, and then Republican and Democrat identification is like 27% each. So there's a vastly more amount of independence than there are Republicans or Democrats. So hypothetically, if independents were unified as a voting bloc and coordinated around independent candidates, they'd be able to win every election. So to your point, at some point the people kind of realize that they've got the numbers, right? And that's the same metaphor as like the farmers end up getting the pitchforks out and dealing with the king, or
Yeah.
whatever happens. Like once there's a moment in time, a tipping point when, the discontentment rises because the tyranny has a greater cost, then has us start to think in new ways, that has us start to organize in new ways. There's going to be fractions within that organization, but then those factions themselves have to be resolved for the ultimate efficacy of the movement. And then before you know it, you end up with a unified front of farmers with pitchforks that can overwhelm the incumbent system. So, and I say that with a nonviolent implication on that metaphor. But that's kind of where we need to be. But at some point, those individuals need to know what they're for and not just what they're against. And that kind of leads us in this new question of like, what are we for as Americans? And at the core of it, we're for a republic that's stewarded and managed with legitimate due process. That's what we're for ultimately at the end of the day, right? The experiment is if we actually do governance of, by, and for the people, then actually, not like feign that, but really just like serve corporate profit interest. But if we actually rigorously govern ourselves, then we'll be able to make good decisions that systematically prevent harm, reduce suffering, improve quality of life, steward our natural world, improve the efficiencies of how our society operates. Like that's the ideal stated in that prayer. And so we have to remember that that's what this is all about ultimately is that self-governance piece of the equation. And an existing political system has just barraged Americans with narratives that you're powerless and the government system is this thing you don't want to be a part of. And even corruption itself can be used as a tactic to be able to dissuade people from participating in government because, I don't want to get close to that. Well, the more people that feel like this, the fewer number of people are challenged to be able to run and govern and exploit. So we need to remember that, like, no, this is our republic. Whatever happens here happens on our watch. We are members of this republic. This public is about self-governance. Self-governance is about the prayer of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. We're here for all of us, and we need to figure out how we address how we've fallen off course of those ideals and bring us back onto track. And so that ultimately, this movement away from corruption, back to real representation, towards transparency, towards accountability, towards empowered citizen participation in the governance process. This is all what we can rally a national movement behind. And you're never going to build a national movement of independence by making the topic you're focused on war or guns or abortion or who pays for drugs. What you're going to build a national movement around is improving governance because this is the topic that unites people from across the political spectrum because you have independents coming from the left, from the right, from everywhere in between. And the one thing that everyone can agree on is a reduction of corruption and an improvement of civic integrity. And when we make that the rally cry and the clarion cry and the clarion call of our national movement, we'll be able to build this national movement of, as I say, tens of millions of Americans who are locked arms to achieve that objective.
And everybody who's what's happened, of course, is that all of these well-meaning movements for whether it's social or economic justice or all of these good ideas that actually extend well-being to more people, they're all siloized. And I think that that's part of an intentional strategy to keep these groups kind of fragmented, marginalized, competing against one another for the limiting, ever more limited nonprofit funds. And so it
or
becomes
or
that
co
kind
or
of
co-opted by the Republican or Democratic Party, right? Because that's that,
exactly,
that's what
yeah,
happens. You have these
yeah,
social movements working on a particular cause.
yes.
The Republican Party says, "Oh, that's ours." The Democratic Party says, "That's ours." It puts them against each other, and now the movement, these social movements that are trying to improve quality of life, are now politicized beyond not the politicization like let's create policy that solves the problem, but politicize like let's reinforce the hyperpolarization engine here. And now this candidate over here can say, vote for me because I support this thing that this cause supports. And now they're driving donor dollars and they're driving hyperpolarized political narratives, et cetera. So it's how those good movements kind of go into these parties to get co-opted.
Of
The
course.
movement itself dies, and the existing system just kind of keeps chugging along.
The Make America Healthy is a great example of that because Democrats who would normally be, yes, let's do that, let's curb the influence of the drug companies and all of a sudden they have to oppose it because it's become politicized on one side or another. And of course, the more emotional energy that's put into these, the more people feel like, well, abortion, that's an existential issue. All of these become existential issues. And what you're saying, bringing people back to a higher awareness um, is that the real existential issue is who's in charge of who's in charge. The real existential issue is an issue of governance. Do we have fair governance? Do we have a playing field where where we can trust? There's been no, I mean, obviously in your lifetime, uh, there's been a complete loss of, if you were born in the 1960s, then when you were a little baby, 75% of people trusted in our government and the institutions of society. Now it's like under 10%, right? So what's wrong? Yeah, what's wrong with this picture? So really, it's really about restoration of trust. We don't have any trust in our government. So one narrative opposing another narrative, it's just a he said, she said. So when I was on your call several weeks ago, the thing that got me most excited is how you're cohering people around this corruption issue. So why don't you speak about that? Because I think that really, if there is a magic Christu, that's really what it is. I think in awakening people to, wait a minute, we all care about the identity issues. Forget that. We want the identical issues: clean air, clean water, clean food, clean government. How do we have that clean government so that we have all of these other things? It's really breaking a trance. It's a big fat trance, and it's a challenge. So tell me more about the how you're looking to break this trance.
Yeah, I think that as I kind of said a little bit before, that trances, as you're saying, at a collective level, have their way of resolving themselves when the premise of the trance is so challenged and degraded, right? So if 20 years ago, a lot of Republicans could say, oh, we are the moral authority, and the Democrats, dot, dot, dot. And Democrats could say, we're the moral authority, but the Republicans, dot, dot, dot. Now, there's very few Republicans or Democrats today who can really make a case that they're standing on any particular moral authority because you see systemic corruption in every direction. You see dysfunction in every direction. You see poor civic culture in every direction. And so these premises are starting to fall apart. And as that's happening, like different aspects of society are starting to fall apart. And people are just waking up to this recognition like, holy smoke, something needs to change. So there's this organic thing that, like, the longer that the trance undermines actual public value, the more it drives an awakening process from the trance itself. So there's kind of this like natural process of awakening that's kind of playing itself out. And and what I want to do at a paradigm level is help to crystallize that because there's this general sense of untrusting government. There's a general sense of corruption. There's a general sense of not actually being represented in government, despite that being the narrative of a representative. But we need to crystallize that in something people can talk about and understand. And the starting point of that is introducing another access to that political narrative. So we all know this XY axis of the left and the right, right? It represents whatever, conservative values and or the Republican Party, progressive values and or the Democratic value. And you can kind of like use that spectrum to kind of create a social economic terrain of assessing political values. It doesn't do a perfect job at it, but it's like decent. That x-axis is what the entire political narrative revolves around. It creates the hyperpolarization and it justifies the we need us to win so that they don't win because their economic and social policies are going to take us off of a cliff. And they're both saying that over and over again. So that x axis in America is hyperpolarized. What's the y axis? Right? The y axis is civic integrity. So down here in this negative dimension of the y-axis, we're going to call that commonplace corruption. And the positive dimension of the y-axis, we're going to call that real representation. So now let's have a whole new conversation. Drop the x-axis for a second. Plot every elected official on where they're at on the y-axis. Oh, they're all hanging out down on this bottom of commonplace corruption when you look at insider trading and personal enrichment and quid pro quo agreements that are illegal but happen anyways and aren't being enforced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's just this cesspool of degraded civic value for elected officials to, at a state level as legislators, at a national level legislators, are perpetually selling out on the people that they're there to represent in service to their own personal interests, which may be careerism. I need to toe the party line to make sure that I don't get primaried and get reelection or make sure I get this committee position or whatever. So they're taking all these actions in service to their own career and or personal enrichment and or whatever else the sticks or carrots that are thrown at them are. So now imagine if you plotted all these elected officials here on this low part of this y-axis of low civic integrity. You say, hey, interesting. There's Republicans and Democrats down there at the bottom of the y-axis. Okay, so the issue is less about the left and the right having different positions. And the real issue is that on both sides, they're selling out of the country. Okay, so now that creates a unified front of people that might associate with the left or the right, realize, oh, we have a common issue and it's systemic corruption. And that I believe will depolarize the x-axis and add polarization to the y-axis because we want polarization there. We want thousands of Americans saying corruption's wrong and bad and we're not tolerating it and we want to change it to a new higher level of civic integrity. So we want to charge that y-axis with a greater level of polarization so we can start to have more conversations around it. We can start to say, look, this isn't okay. We can start to have candidates be plotted on where they stand, elected officials plotted on where they stand, have a whole new conversation about the y-axis of America. So that's at the paradigm level where we start the conversation. Now, next, we have to say, okay, great. How do we ground this from some type of like high level moral judgment statements that corruption's wrong and it should go away? Okay, what is corruption? What are we actually talking about? What are the behaviors that are occurring that we're calling corrupt? And what are the inverse of those behaviors that we would call civic integrity? We have to break it down to all of its constituent components. And then we have to look at like, what are the current laws in our country against corruption, against insider trading, against bribes, against these other elements? And there's laws against many of those things. Now, which of those laws are actually being enforced? Basically nothing. So that gives us a baseline to kind of start the conversation out to actually define, because if we have laws against certain corrupt behaviors, then there's already been a consensus on what is and isn't appropriate behavior, but now we're not enforcing it. So we start the conversation there. So ultimately what our organization is doing is we're taking the idea of corruption and we're breaking it into a definitive set of behaviors that either things that are happening that shouldn't happen or that aren't happening that should happen. And we're calling all of that corrupt activity. And the core premise of corruption is when somebody is elected to represent a body of people. And once they have that power, that seat of office, they use that seat of office not to serve those people, to serve other interests or their own personal interests, whatever. That is the corruption. That is the breakdown. That is the corrupting of that civic integrity, and that you lose representation of the people and you gain representation of special interests. So that is the core premise of corruption. So that's happening all over the place. And there's different behaviors that's happening within. So we're taking the bold path. You mentioned pledge, and this is way beyond pledge, right? So there's a pledge of like, I'm not going to be corrupt, whatever. We're turning into a certification. Think about USDA organic, think about fair trade, think about LEED for building and architecture. These are definitive structures of action and behavior and compliance that you must do to maintain that certification. So we are going to be developing something called the Independent and Corruption-Free Certification. This will be the first certification ever to exist to officially certify elected officials as corruption-free. Now we move it from like a amorphous movement rant to a definitive technical term. Now there's a certification that represents that technical term and monitoring processes and attestation processes to reinforce on a quarterly basis. Now, with it in place, just like the organic stamp, you get to bifurcate all things into two categories, right? USDA Organic was able to bifurcate products when you go shopping between those full of pesticides and those not. So then consumers were empowered. Oh, I can use my dollar to not only get myself a product, but we all know that the purchase of that product is what? It's a vote for more of the agricultural practices in the future to get more of those products for me and other people like me that are coming. So USDA Organic took, as a certification, took the organic agricultural and food product processes from fringe to commonplace in one generation. That's the power of a certification program. So we're looking to do that for corruption free. Right now, there's not one American who says, I only vote certified corruption free. That's because it doesn't exist yet. But next year, I guarantee you there's going to be at least one. 10 years from now, there could be 50 million. 20 years from now, there could be 150 million. So now if you have 150 million Americans who say, oh, we only vote. Why would you possibly vote for someone who doesn't certify corruption free? Why do you vote for someone who refuses to certify, right? And the certification is kind of a foot in the door. It's a Trojan horse because you identify the elected officials who have the highest level of commitment to civic integrity, and they voluntarily have a higher level of accountability and transparency. So now they're committing to a certain set of practices, whether their peers are held accountable or not, because they all have a policy against insider trading, but none of them are held accountable to it. Now you can say that within the certification program, you can't hold individual stocks, you can't trade individual stocks. Okay, now I'm committing to a infrastructure of behavior that prevents me from doing the whole insider trading thing, where now I'm manipulating the public for my own personal enrichment. I'm not trading stocks, but my wife is, or whatever, right? Like that's a whole thing. So this gives us the ability to now have a whole national narrative on the bifurcation, because those who don't end up going through a certification program will eventually end up with a refuse to certify status. Now it allows us to, as people, right? We're saying, look, government has failed to regulate its own government ethics, period. Therefore, the people can no longer trust the judicial branch, the executive branch, or the legislative branch to monitor civic integrity, period, inarguable. Therefore, the people must show up to do what the legislative, judicial, and executive branch are doing and create a new standard and enforcement for civic integrity. And so a certification program is a way that the people can assert their civic power by doing what the government should be doing but isn't doing. And then that establishes the official standard of corruption free, which ultimately, if you have 100 million, 150 million Americans who say, I only vote corruption free, you're a snap away from actually being able to pass that as national legislation, that you take the standard that you establish as a movement and you institutionalize it by not only policy, but enforced policy with teeth at the national level and at the state level. And that's how we open the door toward this ultimate phase change where we institutionalize term limits and we institutionalize the enforcement of the lack of insider trading. And we set the scene for actual civic integrity. And at the core of what that is doing is that's the people flexing their political power to support public institutions and elected officials from reclaiming sovereignty from the undue influence of special interests. So that's the ultimate chiropractic adjustment we need to do to say, actually, the government is in charge, not companies. The government is empowered and stewarded by the people for the purpose of public benefit, not private benefit. And when you cut all these channels and corridors of corrupt activity and opaqueness and impunity towards this, then you're going to start to undermine all the ways that industries have been able to have the access point to controlling seats of office in public institutions. So, if the first independence movement 250 years ago was declaring independence from a foreign crown and from taxation without representation and from reach of rule that they no longer wanted to be subservient to, than our current independence movement, right? It's more profound than just I identify or affiliate as independent. This is a national independence movement, categorically similar to the Revolutionary War 250 years ago. This one's going to be nonviolent, but this time we're declaring independence from domestic capture. And we're asserting that independence through a populist movement that makes it more favorable for corruption free elected officials to get support and less favorable for corruption full elected officials because of this increased amount of transparency that's going to come and hit them like a tidal wave and an increased amount of accountability that's going to hit them like a tidal wave. Imagine if you had citizens that were empowered to file lawsuits around breaches of laws for elected officials in their district or their state that they were otherwise not held accountable to. And now you have this tsunami of effective lawsuits, and some of them end up getting held in court. And now we just snap away this opaque lack of transparency. We snap away this expected impunity. We create a whole new environment, and we set the stage for a new chapter for American history.
Yeah, this is what's really amazing about this. It is so rare to come upon anything that's actually strategic. This is strategic. I swear. I mean, it's not simply we want less corruption. There's a very, very specific way that we can vote for this. I call that the Great Reset, where we set the standard for the government to live by. Yeah, they are our servants. It's like that joke, what we need government of the people, by the people, for the people, where the government does the people's bidding and not the bidding of the highest bidder. So what we're doing, because I feel like I'm a part of this through, the very jokey way that I present stuff, but this is the first uh, independent movement that I could hold in my hands. This is something solid that we can say, here is a way that we, the people, can actually take a stand and assert ourselves in a coherent way, not around some lofty principle, but around a lofty principle that's grounded in this reality of we want to be on this y-axis, not being pulled into this horizontal polarity, but being pulled upward toward a higher standard of governance that actually serves us all and that's what breaks the trans. You were saying that earlier, that the more dysfunctional the government gets, the more dysfunctional the system gets, the more people decouple from that system. But where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? There's no representation in the media. What you're talking about, I haven't read about this in the New York Times. It hasn't
Not
been on
yet.
NPR yet, not
Not
even
yet.
Fox News, right? So the thing is that this is a time when the only way to break the soundless barrier in this regard, the silence that faces anything that genuinely is going to change things, you know, rather than pull people back into the safe arguments that they've been having and, let them fight it out. So what this is becoming the news. So when this movement becomes the news, they'll have to cover it. And I think that this is the first thing that I've seen that whatever you've done in the last year or so, since your last gathering, however you've coalesced this from a great idea into an actual thing that people can gather around. It's Democrats and Republicans. I mean, the Republicans, We're a republic. The Democrats were a democracy. Well, republic is thing of the people. So the thing of the people has become corrupt. It's become rotten. So we don't have to have direct voting for everything, but all we want to do is really um, modulate the governance, this thing that we've created to govern us wisely, so it governs us wisely and truly represents us. So this is something I think this is probably the most encouraging um, way forward that I've seen. So congratulations to you and your team for coming
Thank
up with
you.
this.
Well, thank you. You know, I believe in America. Sometimes I feel like I believe in America more than anybody else because I believe in that ultimate prayer of self-governance, but it needs to be held well. And we need to recognize kind of where we're at in the moment in time that we're at, you know, where the world's at and where ecological breakdown's at and where international policy's at and the role of America in that and where technology is going and all these different pieces and kind of wake up and recognize, whoa, crap, there's actually no one with their hand on the steering wheel. And this thing's about to drive itself off of a cliff. And so we got to like climb up that bus, get our hand on the steering wheel, pull the e-brake, not fall off the cliff. Like there's a moment in time for the citizens
Yeah,
to come
sure.
up fully and forward to protect what was precious to us, which is the idea of America. You know, and I think that that is something that we can all ultimately come back to rally behind. And it's crazy how little the left or the right talks about the Constitution. It's just crazy. It's like we just got into this political system where it's like, no, we talk about political parties and we talk about current events and we talk about things that are hyper polarized, but like the core of this of what this came from, like when's the last time you heard one elected official on either side talk about how people in their districts aren't happy and that we declared independence from Britain so that we could create more happiness for all, and we're not doing that well. Like there's a return to first principles here that I think is part of what's going to enable us to remember and reawaken and have some type of renaissance of civic engagement that has us like show up in a new way to play our role to get the job done.
Wow. Well, before we close, I want to make sure that people know about the event that's happening in Washington, D.C. In September. Tell us more about that and the purpose and focus of this event that you're doing, who you're looking to attract, and if there's anything else that you want to say to nail this whole thing, this whole conversation.
The Independent National Convention, this will be our fourth, and it'll be in Washington, D.C. It'll be September 23rd to 25th. That's a Wednesday through a Friday. It'll be at the JW Marriott, which is right downtown DC. It's right next to the White House. It's right across the street from the Washington Memorial and the Washington Mall. Um, it's really designed for people who see the systemic problem in our country, who understand that the left beating the right or the right beating the left will never solve our problems in our country, and that want to be a part of the actual solution. So we're really assembling this united independent movement. You can kind of think of like the event as a loom that's weaving relationships, weaving people together, weaving narratives together. So people who want to be a part of this solution should come, and you'll find community, you'll find vision, you'll find hope, you'll find energy. And it'll be a beautiful fall moment in DC. So you can have a beautiful experience. Maybe you've never been to DC before and use this as an opportunity. This is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the creation of our country. And so there's an individual kind of initiation rite of passage baked in. It's like, okay, you weren't there 250 years ago, unless you were spiritually or you believe in reincarnation or whatever, but you're here now. And here we are deciding what the next 250 is. You know, do you want somebody else to decide that? Do you want to kind of be in the bleachers, you know, or do you want to, what's that saying? Like people like say like people make it happen, people watch it happen, or people say what happened. It's like of that, what do you want? Do you want to like say what happened and be totally disconnected? Do you want to kind of watch it happen or do you want to make it happen? And if you're more in the make it happen category, come to the Independent National Convention, redeclare your identity as an independent American citizen, and find your role in creating solutions, whether it's in movement building, whether it's in supporting candidates, whether it's supporting policy, whether it's supporting in organizing, whether it's supporting in media like this podcast is right here. Everyone can find a role to play, and you come to the Independent National Convention to kind of share what you think your role is and maybe talk to other people and maybe crystallize. We're actually in a movement wall where we have people kind of identifying what role they want to play in the United Independent Movement. So it's time for people to show up and recognize I am ready to find and play my role in the renewal of our republic. If that inspires you, come to the convention. We haven't got our speaker list out yet. Um, Different people will get invitations, like Thomas Massey is going to get an invitation. We think very highly of him and his stand for the American people. Other independent candidates, I mentioned Dan Osborne will be the types of people get speaking invitations. Andrew Yang, the previous presidential candidate and the founder of the Forward Party, spoke at a previous event. Dennis Kucinich, a previous legislator who then ran for re-election as an independent, spoke in our conventions before. So we've had lots of really great people speak before, and by the time we get to September, we're gonna have a phenomenal slate of speakers, panels, workshops, networking opportunities, meals, social experiences, and a great gala party on Friday night.
That's wonderful. This is really the beginning of truly a true new movement. This is real. And people have been longing for this, whether they know it or not. And once people find out about this, as you say, let's say Dan Osborne or somebody else gets elected, all of a sudden, this becomes news. This is news. As soon as it becomes news, they can't not deal with it. They
Yeah,
can't not deal with it. And so, as this movement begins to speak for itself, the uncommon common sense will be the recruiting arm.
let's go. The URL is independentnationalconvention.com. Um, there's other ways to get involved if you're inspired by this work and you've been trying to figure out how to get some of your personal resources working for the positive development of our country. You want to become a financial partner or a donor, please reach out to me. I'm sure that Steve can include my email address maybe in the show notes or whatnot. We've been funded with donors. We've raised about $500,000 in the last 6 months or so. So we've got donors showing up and writing $10,000 checks and $20,000 checks to move this work forward. That's what moves the work forward. And so if you want to get involved, come to the event. If you want to become a financial partner, reach out to me. We'd love to have your support.
Thank you so much, Christopher Life, for joining us today and sharing this, I would say, a breakthrough in a strategic approach to actually making a necessary shift in our politics. And I'm glad you're in it for the long run, rather than a sense of panic over where we are. It's simply we're gonna this is going to be perhaps the trim tab that turns the entire ship around. So good work, my
Absolutely.
friend.
Thank
Okay.
you. And thanks for giving me a stage on your show. And we can both stay abreast to this situation.
Very good. Take care.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you, folks, for watching. This is Steve Behrman, Signs of the Upwising, and this is certainly a sign of the upwising.